When I accepted the night shift at Holloway Steel, I didn't expect much more than a few dull hours, the smell of hot metal, and the hum of machines as my only companions. The job was straightforward. Watch the machinery, make sure everything runs smoothly, and deal with any minor issues that might arise. I was grateful for the paycheck, and besides, I didn't mind the isolation. It was easier than dealing with the noise of a day shift and, to be honest, I enjoyed the quiet of the factory at night. The factory had been around for nearly a century, one of the last standing giants of an old industrial era. Most of the town had either worked there at some point or had family that did. My father had put in nearly 30 years before retiring, and he swore up and down that Holloway had been cursed since before his time. He'd tell stories about men losing fingers, whole hands, to the machines. Workers who just up and disappeared, never to be seen again. But most of those tales were probably just a mix of exaggeration and urban legend, passed down over beers after a hard day's work. The first few weeks on the job were uneventful. The massive steel presses and conveyor belts operated like clockwork, and I grew comfortable with the monotonous routine. There were a few other night shift workers, but we rarely spoke. Everyone kept to their own station. The only noise in the place came from the rhythmic clanking of the machines and the occasional hiss of steam. Then, one night, things started to get strange. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds. The factory was vast, a labyrinth of iron and steel stretching as far as the eye could see. The shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed to stretch forever, creating dark corners that always felt a little too still. I was making my way past the old section of the factory, the part that hadn't been used in years. Most of the machines there were relics, rusting, broken down, and covered in dust. No one ventured into that area, not unless they had a reason to. As I passed by one of the massive, rusted out presses, I heard a faint sound. It was almost like a whisper, too quiet to make out any words but just loud enough to stop me in my tracks. I turned off my flashlight and stood still, straining to hear it again. But the factory was silent, save for the distant hum of the running machinery. I shook my head, thinking it was probably just my imagination. After all, working nights in a place like this could play tricks on your mind. I kept walking, pushing the odd moment to the back of my mind, but the uneasy feeling in my gut lingered. Later that night, as I was about to finish my shift, I saw something that stopped me cold. I was standing near the break room, sipping my coffee, when I glanced toward the old section of the factory. The shadows there always seemed thicker, darker. But that night, they weren't just dark. They were moving. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, there, in the distance, I saw it again, something shifting in the shadows, just beyond the range of the lights. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was one of the other workers, maybe doing something in the old section. But no one ever went back there, not at this hour. I set my coffee down and grabbed my flashlight, cautiously making my way toward the area. The closer I got, the more my pulse quickened. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast, empty space, and the smell of rust and all grew stronger. When I reached the section, there was nothing, just rusted machines and dust. I scanned the area with my flashlight, half expecting to find some explanation, but everything was still. I shook my head and turned to leave, but as I did, I caught sight of something on the ground, footprints. Fresh footprints in the dust. My heart skipped a beat. They were too small to be from one of the workers, more like the footprints of a child. But what would a child be doing in an abandoned section of a steel factory in the middle of the night? I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced through possible explanations, but none of them made sense. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself it could be an animal. Maybe a raccoon had wandered in, though I knew that was a stretch. I didn't sleep well after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints, leading off into the darkness of the factory. Something about them just didn't sit right with me. A few days later, I overheard one of the older workers, Bill, talking about a kid who used to run around the factory back in the 70s. Apparently, the kid was the son of one of the workers, and he would sometimes tag along with his dad during night shifts. The story didn't have a happy ending, though. One night, the boy went missing. They searched the factory from top to bottom, but never found him. Some people said he'd gotten caught in one of the machines, but others swore they had seen him wandering the factory years later. I didn't want to believe the story had anything to do with what I saw. But as the days passed, things only got worse. I started hearing more of those faint whispers, especially when I passed by the old section. It was always too quiet to make out, but it sent chills down my spine every time. Then there were the lights. The overhead lights in the factory would flicker at random, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. One night, I was finishing up some paperwork in the control room when I heard a loud crash from the old section. It was the kind of noise that made your heart jump into your throat, like something heavy had fallen or been thrown. I rushed out of the control room, grabbing my flashlight and heading toward the source of the sound. As I approached, I saw one of the old machines, a massive, rusted press that hadn't worked in decades, had somehow come to life. The gears were grinding, the belts turning, and the whole thing was shaking violently as if it were ready to explode. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. Standing next to the machine was a figure, a small, shadowy figure. I shined my flashlight on it, but the beam seemed to pass right through. I could see the outline of a child, their head tilted up as if they were staring at something above. I froze, unable to move, my hand shaking as I tried to steady the light. The figure didn't move, didn't react to me at all. It just stood there, watching the machine as it groaned and rattled, like it was waiting for something. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the machine stopped. The figure vanished, and the factory was silent again. I didn't stay to investigate. I turned and ran back to the control room, locking the door behind me. I called the shift supervisor, but he didn't believe me. Said I must have been overtired, imagining things. But I knew what I saw. I wasn't crazy. The next day, I put in my notice. I didn't tell anyone about the figure, or the footprints, or the whispers. I just wanted to leave and never set foot in that factory again. But as I was packing up my things on my last day, Bill came over. He didn't say much, just gave me a knowing look and patted me on the shoulder. "Good call, kid," he said. "Some things in that place ain't meant to be found. I haven't been back to Holloway Steel since, and I don't plan to. But every now and then, late at night, I find myself thinking about that figure by the machine, the way it stood there, watching, waiting. I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to notice it. Or if maybe it's just waiting for someone to take its place." When I got the job at Volmont Metalworks, it was a lifeline. I'd been out of work for months, bills piling up, and I was desperate. Vermont was one of the few places in town still hiring, even though it had a reputation for being tough work. The factory had been around for decades, churning out steel parts for everything from cars to heavy machinery. People said it was haunted, but when you've got mouths to feed, ghost stories don't really scare you. The factory was a maze of conveyor belts, furnaces, and giant presses. It was noisy, hot, and filthy. The walls seemed to drip with decades of grime, and the air was thick with the smell of burning metal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a paycheck, and that was all I cared about. I was put on the night shift, which suited me just fine. Fewer people around meant fewer chances for something to go wrong with coworkers, and I didn't mind the quiet. There were only a handful of us working nights, mostly guys who had been there for years, grizzled old-timers who barely spoke. They did their jobs and went home. No one lingered after their shift. On my first night, as I was settling into my routine, one of the old-timers, a guy named Earl, pulled me aside. Earl had been at Vermont for over 20 years, and he looked like he'd seen it all. His eyes were sunken, his face leathery, and his hands were covered in scars from decades of handling hot metal. "Listen," he said, his voice gravelly, "stay away from the old forge in the back of the factory. That's where things happen." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to spook the new guy. "What, you mean ghosts?" Earl's expression didn't change. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and serious. "You'll see. If you're smart, you won't go near it." I didn't give it much thought at the time. I mean, every old factory has its ghost stories, right? It's just part of the lore. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing things, weird things. The factory was always noisy, with the clang of metal on metal and the hum of machinery. But there were moments when the noise would suddenly stop, just for a second. And in that brief silence, I'd hear something else. A low, almost inaudible sound, like metal scraping against stone. It was faint, but distinct. At first, I thought it was just the normal creaks and groans of the building. But it kept happening, always at the same time, just after midnight, and always from the direction of the old forge. The old forge was in a section of the factory that hadn't been used in years. It was a massive, hulking machine, covered in rust and dust, with chains hanging from the ceiling like spider webs. No one went near it. The other workers avoided that part of the building altogether, and I soon started doing the same. But the noises continued. One night, I was doing my rounds, checking the machines and making sure everything was running smoothly. It was a quiet night, and I had just passed the break room when I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just metal scraping. It was clanging, like something heavy being dropped onto the floor. I froze, my heart racing. I knew where the sound was coming from, and every instinct told me to ignore it, to walk away and pretend I hadn't heard it. But something pulled me toward the old forge. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. Either way, I found myself walking down the long, dark corridor toward the back of the factory. As I got closer, the air grew colder. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me, which made no sense in a place as hot as Vermont. The clanging grew louder, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. When I reached the forge, the noise stopped abruptly, leaving the air heavy with silence. I shined my flashlight toward the forge, and that's when I saw it. Standing in front of the massive machine was a figure. It was tall and broad-shouldered, but its body seemed wrong, like it wasn't entirely solid. Its skin, or what I assumed was skin, had the texture of molten metal, glowing faintly in the dark. Chains dangled from its arms, dragging on the ground as it moved. I took a step back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure turned toward me, and I saw its face, or what was left of it. It was disfigured, a twisted mess of metal and flesh, with eyes that burned like hot coals. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as I realized this thing was watching me, waiting. Before I could react, the figure let out a deep, guttural growl and moved toward the forge. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted down the corridor, not daring to look back, and didn't stop until I reached the break room. I locked myself in the break room, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination from exhaustion? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I knew what I had seen was real. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I avoided the back of the factory and stayed close to the other workers, not daring to mention what had happened. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. The next morning, as I was about to leave, Ol approached me again. He didn't say anything, just gave me a knowing look. He didn't need to ask if I had seen it. He already knew. I didn't quit right away. I needed the money, and part of me still didn't believe what I had seen. But the sightings continued. Every few nights, I'd hear the same clanging and scraping coming from the old forge, and every time, I'd feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. It wasn't just me either. Some of the other guys started mentioning strange things happening around the factory. Tools would go missing, machines would malfunction for no reason, and a few workers even claimed they'd seen shadows moving in the corners of their vision. But no one talked about it openly. It was like we had an unspoken agreement to keep quiet. Then one night, everything changed. I was working late, doing some maintenance on one of the machines, when I heard a blood-curdling scream. It echoed through the factory, sending chills down my spine. I dropped my tools and ran toward the sound, my heart in my throat. I found one of the new guys, a kid named Danny, standing in front of the old forge. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He was shaking, pointing at something in the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything. But then, slowly, the figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same thing I had seen weeks before, the twisted, molten creature with chains hanging from its arms. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures were emerging, their bodies glowing faintly in the dark, their eyes burning with the same fiery intensity. They moved slowly, their chains dragging on the ground, filling the air with a low, metallic hum. Danny screamed again and bolted for the exit. I didn't hesitate. I followed him, running as fast as I could, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. That was my last night at Vermont. I didn't even bother to collect my things. I never went back, and I never spoke to anyone from the factory again. I heard later that it shut down a few months after I left, though no one could tell me exactly why. But I know the truth. There's something in that factory, something that shouldn't exist. And it's still there, waiting in the darkness, chained to the old forge, waiting for someone to set it free. I had been working in factories my whole life. After nearly a decade of experience, I thought I'd seen it all until I landed a job at Redmond Textiles. It wasn't the best gig in the world, but they were paying more than my previous job, so I signed on without asking too many questions. What struck me as odd right away was the fact that no one really talked about the place, even though it had been a staple in the town for over 50 years. It was like people either forgot it existed or chose not to remember. My first day on the job was uneventful, just the usual paperwork and orientation. The manager, a tall, thin guy named Mr. Groves, walked me through the factory. It was a sprawling old building, much larger than I had expected, with creaky floors and dim lighting. The machinery looked ancient. Rusted conveyor belts, sewing machines that whirled like they were stuck in another era. Everything about the place felt like it hadn't changed in decades. The only thing that seemed remotely new was the odd hum that buzzed constantly in the air, almost like the building itself was alive, breathing under the weight of years of dust and forgotten history. As Mr. Groves was walking me through the floor, he pointed toward the far end of the factory, where a door was bolted shut. "That's the West Wing," he said, his tone low and dismissive. "We don't go there. It's been closed off for years. No reason to worry about it." I glanced at the door, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Every old factory has places that are off limits, usually because they're too run down or unsafe. I nodded and went back to paying attention to his instructions. The work itself wasn't too bad. It was monotonous, sure, but not anything I hadn't dealt with before. The shifts, however, were brutal. 12-hour night shifts that stretched into the early morning hours. After a few weeks, I had settled into a rhythm, though something always felt a bit off. The hum in the air never went away, and every now and then the lights would flicker, just for a second, like the factory was experiencing tiny power surges. One night, about 3 months into the job, I was on my break when I noticed something odd. I was sitting alone in the break room when I heard footsteps. They were faint, but unmistakable. Someone was walking around the factory floor. I assumed it was one of the other workers, maybe just checking the machines, so I didn't pay much attention at first. But the footsteps continued, slowly pacing back and forth. Curious, I got up and peeked through the small window in the door that led to the main floor. The factory was empty. The machines were still running, whirring and clicking in their usual steady rhythm, but there wasn't a soul in sight. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for a few moments, trying to figure out what I had just heard, when the lights flickered again. This time, they stayed off for longer than usual, plunging the factory into darkness for what felt like an eternity. When they finally came back on, the door to the West Wing was slightly ajar. I knew it had been bolted shut. Mr. Groves had made a point of telling me that. But now it was open, just enough for someone to slip through. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself not to go over there, that it wasn't my problem, but something in me couldn't resist. I had to know what was behind that door. I grabbed a flashlight from my locker and made my way across the factory floor, the hum in the air growing louder with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The hinges squealed as the door swung inward, revealing a long, narrow hallway that led into the West Wing. The air was colder back there, and the smell of mildew and rot was overwhelming. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. The hallway led to a large room filled with old, rusted machines that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. But they were running. The belts were moving, gears were turning, and the hum in the air was deafening now. My heart raced as I walked through the room, my footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Something wasn't right. None of these machines were supposed to be functional, but they were all working, churning out fabric that crumbled to dust the moment it left the loom. Then I saw them, shadows darting between the machines. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it, voices. They were faint, almost whispers, but I could hear them coming from the far end of the room. I followed the sound, my legs trembling as I made my way toward the back of the West Wing. The voices grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out what they were saying. And then I saw them, workers, dozens of them, sitting at sewing machines that had long since rusted over, their heads bowed in silence as their hands moved in perfect synchrony. I froze. These people, these workers, they couldn't be real. Their clothes were tattered, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. They moved mechanically, their eyes staring blankly ahead as they worked the machines. They were like ghosts, trapped in some sort of endless, nightmarish loop. Suddenly, one of them looked up at me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting erratic beams of light across the room. The worker's eyes were hollow, empty, like they had been drained of life. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum grew louder, more intense, like the entire factory was alive and angry. The machines in the main room started clanking louder as I passed, as if they were reacting to my presence. I didn't stop until I reached the break room, slamming the door behind me. I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? Were those real people, ghosts? I had no idea, but I knew I had to get out of there. As I grabbed my things and headed for the exit, Mr. Groves appeared in the hallway. He looked at me with a calm, almost bored expression, like he knew exactly what I had just witnessed. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I didn't respond. I just nodded, my hands shaking. "They've been here for a long time," he continued, leaning against the doorframe. "Longer than any of us. The factory never really closed, you see. They kept working, even after the place shut down." I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. Why are they still here?" I finally managed to ask. Mr. Groves shrugged. "I don't know. Some say it's a curse, others say they're just stuck. But it doesn't matter. They're not going anywhere. They'll keep working, night after night, until the factory finally crumbles to dust." I didn't wait to hear any more. I pushed past him and ran out of the factory, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I never went back to Redmond Textiles, and I never spoke about what I saw that night. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the hum of the machines. It's faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it's there. And I know those workers are still in that factory, sewing, weaving, endlessly trapped in their own personal hell. I had been driving trucks for over 15 years, mostly hauling freight between states, but one night stood out like a scar in my memory. A night I wish I could forget but never will. It started off like any other, with a delivery scheduled for a factory just outside of town. But something about that place, the Dalemont Steelworks, felt off from the moment I laid eyes on it. Dalemont Steelworks had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Rusted gates, cracked windows, and vines creeping up the sides of the old brick building gave it the kind of look you'd expect from a place long forgotten. But recently, I'd heard rumors that someone had reopened the factory. I didn't question it at first. It wasn't my business, I just had a job to do. It was close to midnight when I pulled my truck up to the gate. The sky was pitch black, and the only source of light was the beam from my truck's headlights. There wasn't a single light on inside the factory, not even a flicker. That struck me as odd. Factories run 24/7, and there's always some light. Always. I honked the horn a couple of times, but no one came to the gate. I was about to call it quits and drive back when I noticed the gate creak open, slowly and silently, like someone had nudged it from the other side. I leaned out the window, looking for anyone, but I saw no movement, no sign of a person. Just the yawning darkness ahead. "Hello." I called out into the night, but the only response I got was the whisper of the wind. I had two options: leave and call my dispatcher to tell them no one was here, or go inside and drop off the load like I was supposed to. Against my better judgment, I went with the latter. I pulled the truck forward, the tires crunching on the gravel as I drove up to the main entrance. The factory loomed above me, towering and ancient. The sense of isolation crept in, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I parked the truck and turned off the engine. Silence, a suffocating kind of silence. I got out of the truck and grabbed my clipboard, heading for the loading dock. As I walked, my footsteps echoed, bouncing off the old metal walls of the factory. I tapped my flashlight and swept it around the area. Everything looked normal, as far as I could tell, but that feeling of unease gnawed at me. The loading dock door was open, slightly ajar like the gate had been. The kind of open that invites you in, even though you know you shouldn't go. I stepped inside, expecting the usual: forklifts, pallets of steel, workers in hard hats. But what I found was far from usual. The place was empty. Not just deserted, but empty like it had never been in use. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there were no machines, no steel piles, nothing. Just an open, cavernous space that stretched into darkness. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, and that's when I saw them, shadows moving at the far end of the factory. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a bird or a rat had darted across the floor, and my tired brain had exaggerated it into something more. But then I saw it again, something moving, shifting just beyond the reach of my light. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "Anyone here?" No answer. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the dusty concrete, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing just inside the shadows, watching me. My flashlight flickered again, and the figure seemed to vanish, melting into the darkness like smoke. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have turned around right then and there. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of there before something went horribly wrong. But I didn't listen. I stepped deeper into the factory, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what the hell was going on. As I moved closer to where I'd seen the figure, the air grew colder. Not the normal kind of cold you get from an abandoned building, but a bone-deep chill that made my breath fog up in front of me. The floor beneath me felt different too, softer, like I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. Then I heard it, a low, grinding noise like metal scraping against metal. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but it grew louder with every step I took. The air smelled of rust and oil, and the sound of machinery echoed through the empty factory. I reached the far end of the room, where the shadows had been moving, and that's when I saw it. An old assembly line, the kind used for mass production. It was running. Gears turned, conveyor belts moved, but there was no power, no electricity running through the factory. It was as if the machines were running on their own, powered by something unseen. And that's when I saw them again, the shadows. This time, they weren't just figures in the corner of my vision. They were everywhere, moving between the machines, hunched over the assembly line, their hands working furiously, even though there was nothing on the belts, nothing to assemble. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The figures were humanoid, but there was something wrong about them, something not quite right. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they were being controlled by invisible strings. One of them looked up at me, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Its face was gaunt, pale, and hollow, like all the life had been sucked out of it. The eyes, if you could even call them that, were black pits, empty and soulless. Its mouth opened, and I heard a sound that wasn't human or guttural, mechanical rasp that made my blood run cold. The others looked up too, their black, hollow eyes fixating on me. One by one, they turned away from the assembly line and started moving toward me, their footsteps slow and deliberate, but the sound of metal clanking echoed with each step. Panic set in. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. But they kept coming faster now, their movements more erratic, more frenzied. The noise in the factory grew louder, deafening, grinding, clanking, screeching, as if the entire place was waking up from some long, haunted slumber. I turned and ran, the shadows chasing after me. Their footsteps were right behind me, growing louder, closer. I stumbled through the dark factory, barely able to see where I was going, my flashlight flickering with every step. I could hear them breathing now, a mechanical wheeze that sounded like metal grinding on metal. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest, but the shadows were right behind me, reaching out with bony, mechanical hands. I burst through the door, back out onto the loading dock, and slammed it shut behind me. The noise stopped. The factory fell silent once again, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, panting, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my truck keys. I didn't wait to see if the shadows would follow me. I jumped into the cab, started the engine, and floored it out of there, gravel spraying behind my tires. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The factory loomed in the distance, dark and silent once again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something that wasn't bound by the walls of that cursed building. I never went back to Diamond Steelworks. In fact, I quit driving altogether after that night. But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the grinding of metal, the clank of footsteps, and the low, mechanical wheeze of the shadows that chased me. And I know deep down that the factory never really shut down. The machines are still running, the workers are still there, and they're waiting for the next unlucky soul to cross their path. The Linwood Textile Factory had been a prominent establishment in our town for decades. My grandfather worked there, my father did too, and when it was my turn, I followed in their footsteps. It wasn't exactly glamorous work, but it paid the bills. We were a close, knit community, and the factory was our heart. When the machines finally shut down in the early 2000s, the town felt its pulse weaken. That was 10 years ago. Nobody went near the place anymore. Linwood had become a ghost of its former self, crumbling brick by brick. The walls were streaked with years of neglect, windows cracked and missing in places, and the old factory floors were littered with debris. Despite the years of abandonment, the rumor mill in our small town never seemed to let go of the past. People claimed they saw strange things there, shadows moving in the broken windows, strange lights flashing late at night. I didn't believe any of it. It was just a story, something to pass the time for the old-timers. But when my buddy Marcus dared me to go inside and spend the night, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was boredom. Maybe I was just tired of hearing the same old ghost stories. "I'll do it," I said, confidently, tossing back the last sip of my beer. Marcus grinned, his eyes lighting up with the challenge. "That's the spirit. You last until sunrise. I'll give you $100. No sneaking out, no chickening out. Deal?" I shook his hand, sealing the bet. That's how I found myself standing at the rusted front gates of Linwood Textile Factory on a Friday night, a flashlight in one hand, and a backpack with a few essentials slung over my shoulder. The factory loomed in front of me, its towering chimneys barely visible against the night sky. The place felt colder than it should have been for early autumn. There was no wind, but the air seemed to cling to my skin, heavy and damp. Just one night, I muttered to myself, pushing open the gate with a screech that echoed in the stillness. The path leading up to the main building was overgrown with weeds, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light came from the dim beam of my flashlight, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker with each step I took. I could almost hear the whispers of the past in the wind, voices of the men and women who had once worked tirelessly inside those walls. I reached the entrance, a heavy metal door, half off its hinges. It groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the dark expanse of the main floor. The ceiling stretched high above me, the old conveyor belts hanging limp from rusted rafters. Piles of forgotten fabric and machinery parts were scattered across the floor. The only sound was the echo of my own footsteps. I set up camp in what used to be the break room, a small, windowless space near the back of the factory. There was an old, faded couch pushed up against the wall, a reminder of when workers used to sit there, eating their lunch and sharing stories. I unrolled my sleeping bag and sat down, pulling out my phone to check the time. 11:45 p.m. I had roughly 6 hours to go before sunrise. Easy. I leaned back, listening to the silence, my mind wandering back to the old stories I'd heard as a kid. The legends said the factory had been cursed, something to do with a fire that broke out in the early 1950s. Supposedly, several workers had died, trapped inside when the machinery malfunctioned and ignited a pile of fabric. Some said their spirits never left, haunting the place, waiting for anyone foolish enough to disturb their rest. But those were just stories. I didn't believe in ghosts. A sudden clang echoed from somewhere deep in the factory. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. Probably just a rat knocking something over, I told myself. This place was falling apart, after all. There was bound to be some noise. Still, I picked up my flashlight and stood, peering out into the dark hallway. Nothing but shadows. I shook off the unease and sat back down, but the feeling wouldn't go away. My instincts were on high alert, the kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone. Minutes passed. I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the factory was still. Suddenly, there was another sound, this time much closer. A distinct thud, followed by the unmistakable squeak of old metal scraping against metal. My hands tightened around the flashlight as I got to my feet again. The sound seemed to be coming from the factory floor. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the break room, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoed, bouncing off the walls in an eerie rhythm. The factory floor was just as I had left it, empty, silent. I scanned the room, my light catching on the rusted machinery, the conveyor belts, and there, in the corner, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a trick of the light. A figure stood at the far end of the room, half hidden behind an old loom. My heart skipped a beat as I aimed my flashlight directly at it, expecting to see another person, maybe a homeless guy or some kind of prankster. But it wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It wore what looked like an old factory uniform, stained and tattered. Its face was gaunt, hollowed out, and its eyes were pure black, staring straight at me without blinking. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, neither of us moved. The figure just stood there, watching me, its head cocked slightly to the side as if it was trying to figure out what I was doing in its space. Then, slowly, it stepped out from behind the loom, its footsteps silent on the dusty floor. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the figure glided toward me. It stopped just a few feet away, and I could see its face more clearly now. Sunken eyes, lips pulled back into a grotesque grin, teeth yellow and sharp. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice was gone. The figure tilted its head again, and then, in a voice that sounded like the grinding of metal, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." That was all it said. Just for words, but they cut through me like a knife. And then, it was gone. One moment it was standing there, and the next, it had vanished, as if it had melted into the shadows. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I ran, sprinting across the factory floor, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the cool night air, my heart racing. I didn't tell Marcus what happened that night. I didn't take his $100 either. I just wanted to forget. But I couldn't. The memory of that figure haunted me. Its black eyes and twisted grin burned into my mind. I never went near Linwood Textile Factory again, and I never will.